The MS Estonia cut through the dark Baltic waters, its lights shimmering across the rolling waves like distant stars. On board, passengers moved about in the warm, softly lit corridors, some heading toward the restaurants, others retiring to their cabins. It was September 27th, 1994, and the ship had set sail from Tallinn to Stockholm, carrying 989 souls, passengers and crew alike. In the moonlight lounge, a small group of travelers laughed over drinks, their conversations a blend of Swedish, Finnish, and Estonian. A middle-aged couple, Marco and Lisa, leaned against the railing on the outer deck, enjoying the crisp sea breeze. "It's a perfect night," Marco said, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. Lisa nodded, her blonde hair catching the light. Nearby, a young deckhand named Henrik checked the horizon with a glance, then his watch. The seas were getting rougher, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for the Baltic in autumn. He made his way to the bridge, where Captain Arvo Anderson and his crew monitored the ship's course. The wind was beginning to pick up, and swells had grown, but they had crossed these waters in worse conditions. Below deck, in the vehicle hold, cars and trucks were secured behind thick metal barriers. The sea roared outside, waves lapping against the hull with increasing force. Henrik radioed his colleague near the bow visor, double-checking the integrity of the locking mechanism. Everything seemed secure. It would be another routine voyage. By midnight, the storm had fully descended upon the Estonia. The wind howled like a living thing, slamming against the ferry with furious intent. Passengers struggled to keep their balance in the corridors as the ship rocked violently. Some had retired early, unaware of the worsening conditions, while others braved the lounge, their drinks trembling in their hands. On the bridge, the mood had shifted. The waves were now over 4 meters high, crashing into the ferry's bow with thunderous force. Captain Anderson furrowed his brow as he noticed an unusual shudder in the ship's frame. "Check the bow locks again," he ordered. An officer complied, calling down to the crew monitoring the car deck. Henrik was among them, pacing near the heavy doors that separated the vehicle hold from the open sea. A loud, unsettling groan vibrated through the metal. He exchanged a glance with his colleague. Then, without warning, a deafening clang echoed through the hull. The bow visor had given way. A massive surge of seawater poured into the hold, engulfing vehicles and washing over the deck like a monstrous tide. The ship lurched forward violently as water filled its lower compartments. Alarms blared. Shouts of confusion erupted among the crew. "Seal the compartments. We have flooding," someone screamed over the radio. On the upper decks, passengers felt the ship's sudden dip. Marco grabbed Lisa's arm as they staggered in the swaying corridor. "Something's wrong," she said, panic rising in her voice. Around them, others looked just as alarmed. A steward tried to reassure them, but his own face was pale with fear. The Estonia was now listing dangerously to starboard. Panic spread like wildfire as crew members rushed through the hallways, instructing passengers to don life jackets and move to the upper decks. The ship was sinking faster than anyone had anticipated. In the lounge, tables overturned as the vessel tilted, sending glasses and plates crashing to the floor. Henrik, soaked from the seawater below, pushed his way through the panicked crowd. "Get outside. Move toward the lifeboats," he shouted. On the deck, lifeboats swung violently in the storm. nearly impossible to lower in the fierce wind. Crew members struggled with the release mechanisms, while terrified passengers clung to whatever they could. Marco and Lisa managed to reach an open section of railing, where a handful of life rafts were being deployed. "We have to jump," Marco shouted over the storm. Lisa's eyes widened in terror. "No, we can't." Before she could finish, a wave slammed into the deck, washing people overboard. Marco grabbed onto the railing, holding Lisa with all his strength. Nearby, Henrik helped a crying child into a lifeboat, his hands numb from the cold. The ship groaned again, tilting at a sickening angle. With one final violent shudder, the Estonia was nearly on its side. Screams filled the air as people were thrown into the sea, their bodies swallowed by the freezing black water. As the Estonia slipped beneath the waves, those who had made it into the water faced a new horror: the unforgiving Baltic Sea. The freezing temperatures sapped the strength from survivors within minutes. Marco surfaced, gasping for breath, his arms flailing as he searched for Lisa. "Lisa!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. Henrik clung to an overturned raft, pulling in anyone he could reach. The child he had helped earlier shivered violently in his arms, her lips turning blue. Around them, voices screamed for help, then fell silent, one by one. In the distance, rescue helicopters approached, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, but time was against them. The cold claimed many before help could arrive. Out of 989 people aboard, only 137 would survive. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the sea was littered with debris, lifeboats, personal belongings, and the last remnants of a ship that had once carried hopes, dreams, and lives. The Estonia was gone, swallowed by the abyss, leaving behind only silence. Hours passed before the first survivors were pulled from the icy water. Henrik, barely conscious, felt strong arms hoisting him into a rescue boat. He gasped, his throat burning as a thermal blanket was wrapped around him. The child he had saved lay beside him, unmoving at first, until a shallow, ragged breath confirmed she was still alive. Relief washed over him, though it was overshadowed by the hundreds lost to the sea. Marco, battered by the waves, clung to a floating section of debris, his mind clouded with exhaustion and grief. He had lost Lisa in the chaos, her fingers slipping from his grasp in the darkness. A desperate hope lingered. Perhaps she had found another raft. Perhaps she was waiting on a lifeboat. But as the hours dragged on, the bitter reality set in. He was alone. The survivors were few, their faces pale and hollow as they huddled in the rescue boats. Helicopters hovered above, winching up the barely living, while searchlights combed the wreckage-strewn sea. There were too many bodies and not enough answers. On the mainland, news of the disaster spread like wildfire. Families gathered at ports and hospitals, desperate for information. The world reeled at the scale of the tragedy, demanding to know how such a catastrophe could have happened. Investigations would follow, inquiries would be made. But for those who had endured that night, explanations would never undo the nightmare they had lived. As Henrik sat shivering in the rescue boat, he looked back at the vast, empty sea. The Estonia had vanished beneath the waves, but its ghost would linger forever in the memories of those who had survived, and in the haunting silence of the deep.